So for those of you who don't know, I really like the story of Persona 5 Royal. Something about the way it presents its characters and their struggles to the audience was something that really intrigued me from the moment I first picked it up. I think it does really well for itself by being sort of a social commentary on things we can relate to in this day and age. It takes place in modern day Shibuya but deals with concepts that are pretty universal, even when it comes to the bosses that you face in the form of palace rulers. While the shadow versions are understandably exaggerated to emphasize just how different the cognitive world is from our world, the bosses themselves still feel fairly tethered to reality. However, there is one thing that I found weird about Persona 5 Royal's storytelling, specifically the structure of Persona 5 Royal's bosses, and it's kind of been bothering me ever since I finished the game. And when I say it bothered me, I don't mean to say that it's bad, but just something that rubbed me the wrong way, so I figured I'd talk a little bit about it today. So with that being said, make sure to like and subscribe, and let's get into it. So when you start the story, you play as Joker, a high school student who ends up transferring to Shujin Academy because of an assault on his record. And that false accusation came at the hands of a man named Masayoshi Shido, a corrupt politician that had Joker arrested and labeled as a criminal after Joker stepped in to save someone from being harassed by Shido. And as we go through the game as the Phantom Thieves, we eventually go through multiple villains. We end up going against Maruki, an artist who abuses his students and plagiarizes their work, Kaneshiro, the leader of a gang who's been using students to smuggle drugs, and Jeff Bezos, Kunikazu Okumura, a corrupt CEO who's been exploiting his workers. Now, after we go through all of these bosses, we end up fighting Shido again near the end of the game. But this time we have all of the friends we made along the way to back us up. And this is honestly my favorite arc in the game, and Shido is by far my favorite boss in the game. Because it's at this point that the journey of the protagonist thus far comes to a climax here. Every boss we fought against so far has been leading to this fight that has you face off against the man who set us on this journey in the first place, with friends we likely never would have met if it weren't for him. Everything about this palace and this fight is climactic. Even the scale of the palace itself is something that at this point had yet to be seen. Every palace we've entered thus far has been distorted, but not to this extent. Most palaces had encompassed a building or maybe a city at most, but Shido's cognition was so distorted that his cognitive world's reach spanned over the entire country. And that serves to show not only the characters but the player that this challenge is like nothing we've ever seen before. And as you go through the palace, you end up finding out that everything that happened throughout the course of the story was because of Shido, which in and of itself is threatening simply because of how far his influence reaches. And the fact that you never see his shadow until the boss fight, and when you do, it comes with one of the most intimidating scenes in the game when he gives that speech, it really racks up the tension. And also I think Makoto has one of the coolest lines of dialogue here as well.
You're nothing but a criminal who rose above others by climbing a staircase of sin.
And while the actual design of his shadow when you get to the fight is a little busy, when Rivers in the Desert starts up, you really feel the intensity. Now, if it seems like I'm spending a little too much time on the preamble, it's because you really can't introduce Shido and his palace without knowing everything that went into it. Shido's boss fight is the consummation of everything we've done as the Phantom Thief so far, and in my opinion, everything about him screams final boss. And in Royal, when they decided to add the one-on-one fight between you and Shido, it made a great boss fight even greater. Because beating Shido in a one-on-one as the person whose life he essentially ruined was a great way to wrap up the story of the protagonist in a satisfying way. Once you beat his boss and move on to fighting Yaldabaoth, because it wouldn't be a Persona game if you weren't fighting God, it really feels like once Shido is defeated, everything about Joker's story is over. Except for one little problem: Dr. Maruki. And this is where the structural problems of Persona 5 Royal begin. Every boss fight before Shido has been leading to that fight. As we go through Shido's palace, we learned that everything we've done and every villain we've faced has all been connected to him, with the exception of Kamoshida, Sai, and to some extent Futaba. It was revealed that Madarame, Kaneshiro, and Okumura all helped fund Shido's exploits, and then later on we learned that Shido was the one who sent Akechi to kill Futaba's mom and Haru's dad. And even though Dr. Maruki is a compelling villain in what's essentially the epilogue chapter of Persona 5 Royal, it ends up feeling extremely disconnected from the original story. And it really served to hurt the story in some ways more than help it. And not to say that the palace was bad, I think the third semester as a whole was still great. I think some of the concepts introduced there were also really cool, like learning the truth about Kasumi and Maruki's past, as well as getting a closer look into the Phantom Thieves and their desires, added a lot of depth to the story and the characters within it. But when it comes to Maruki as an antagonist and as a boss fight, it never really felt as climactic as Shido's did, because throughout the story, Maruki was present but never really affected the narrative as much as Shido did. Maruki's social link was fine, but nothing we did during that social link ever really changed the course of the story, which in turn made him seem less intimidating when you get to his boss fight. And I understand that the game was setting up for the big reveal in the third semester, so they couldn't have him be too active of a presence in the narrative, but because of the lack of direct involvement in the overarching story until the third semester, when the final boss was revealed to be Maruki, it ended up creating very little tension when compared to characters like Shido. While the scale Maruki operates on is much larger than Shido, it's not nearly as personal as with Shido. Shido was always this larger-than-life presence throughout Persona 5 Royal. He was relatively close yet very distant at the same time, which made the moment when you're face to face with his shadow feel so intimidating. But when it comes to Maruki, you never really get that feeling. And while Maruki's fight was cinematic, that lack of narrative weight diminishes a lot of the tension in that fight, and takes it from a climactic final boss to just another boss that we have to stop. Shido's palace carried a lot of narrative weight. Everything we did as the Phantom Thieves throughout the course of the game was to get to him. And after defeating Yaldabaoth, it really felt like the story could have come to a close, which is what made the ending of Vanilla Persona 5 so satisfying. And while the ending of Royal was also satisfying, I feel like it had more to do with the fate of the characters than the narrative actually feeling conclusive, because in some ways, it felt like the story was already done before we started the third semester. And this problem only really got worse when you find out that Shido was the one who shut down Maruki's research, because that just means Maruki is another byproduct of what Shido did. It feels like everything that happens in Persona 5 Royal is connected to Shido, and even when you get into the third semester that does well to focus on Maruki and Kasumi, it feels like the shadow of Shido is still there. And while it's great that they were able to make such a great antagonist, it really feels like the structure of Persona 5 Royal suffers because of it. Because when you get to Maruki, he really just kind of feels like an afterthought instead of a legitimate antagonist to our characters, which is unfortunate because maybe if he had been the palace before Shido and it was revealed in Shido's palace that he was the one who shut down Maruki's research, I feel like something along those lines would have fit better narratively. If they had saved all the cinematic moments that were in Maruki's palace for Shido's palace, I feel like the story would have felt more conclusive than it ending with Maruki's palace. And while at the end of the day I do think the story is fine, part of me always felt that while Maruki was the final boss of Persona 5 Royal, as far as the story goes, the person that feels like the true final boss was Shido.